I hope you've been enjoying the real truth about health and opening your minds, but more importantly, your hearts. And today we're going to open our hearts to a subject that many of us really speak about, but we don't go directly for it. And that's really the foes that we have, the unfortunate problems we have with so-called foods. And these foods, by the way, are killing us. They're our foes, they're not our friends. So here we go now.
Rich, you have to share the screen on the Brian Clement too. And also, Brian, can you lower your mic a little bit? It's a little bit too loud.
Okay.
That's perfect.
How about that?
Perfect. Okay, can you go back to the first slide? So go all the way back to the first slide. Great. Okay, we're ready.
Okay, I can't see the slides. So now we speak about the formidable foes. So there are several absolutely clear scientific indicators that we are all, as humans, Homo sapiens, plant-based consumers. We're just going to talk about three and then preface it with a few other things. There's three incontrovertible facts about plant-based diets and the requirement we have to consume them. The number one is clear. I want you to really look at this. And there's a lot of discussion about it, but we are going to lay it out today in a way that we should silence any debate over if we're carnivores or omnivores or herbivores and human. So look at your screen there at the carnivore's teeth. Next to it, you see the herbivore. They consume animal and plant. Then we go down to the herbivore, the frugivore, and then the human teeth. Now, what I want you to really note, without any hesitation, that in 100% of the cases, a carnivore has fangs. Now, the silliness to say that the two little pointy teeth that we have towards the front of our mouth are for meat consumption is ridiculous. That's to rip leaf. If you look at an omnivore, they have less fangs because they're not exclusively eating animals. They basically also need some of what an herbivore has, grinders in the back, etc. And so clearly, if you look at what our teeth look like and what a carnivore and an herbivore looks like, we are not the same. Secondly, every single creature that, by the way, is a plant-based eater stands up on two legs. There's no other creature that stands up, as we do, upright on two legs as a plant-based consumer. The next thing I want to point out is the hands. Our hands are very flexible and movable. And in fact, look at how we can address picking up different things. Where the fact is, a carnivore has claws, and they require the claws in the consumption of the food that they're meant to eat. Now, there's a place for carnivores. Remember, that the balance that was here, the ecosystem balance, up until man came in and intervened and started to throw everything out of kilter, was there were certain animals that would grow in large herds, and the carnivores made sure that that was kept at a lower population. Also, birds evolved like vultures to clean up the carcasses of dead animals to reduce bacterial and microbial infection, not only for humans, obviously, but for other creatures. Now, the second, we want to look at a dog, which is a typical and a very familiar carnivore. And this is reflective of every carnivore's intestinal tract. It's very short, and it's loaded with hydrochloric acid. So much so that if you put your fist inside of the intestinal tract of a dog and let it sit there for a couple of minutes, the flesh would be eaten off. That's how active the hydrochloric acid is. We have this elongated intestinal tract that's about 9 times your height. So if you weigh, not weigh, but if you're 6 feet high, it's 6 times 9. And what's amazing, it's very sophisticated, that along the way, it actually absorbs nutrients from plants and the cellulose in plants, categorically takes out the different forms of nutrients, not only the obvious vitamins, minerals, proteins, etc., but the phytonutrients, the phenols, etc. And this evolved over God knows how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. The next thing you have to know, and I made a presentation on The Real Truth About Health on this subject, the recent data now absolutely indicates without any hesitation that your intestinal flora and fauna is actually built to be consuming only plants. And the reality of that is that these plants have the kind of nutrient cofactors in them that literally allow the bacteria to flourish in a particular way. And by flourishing, activate 80% of your immune system, which is actually your protector from disease and aging. Ultimately, what's more impressive than anything else is 90% of the happy juices, serotonin, literally are dependent upon you eating a plant-based diet. And a raw plant-based diet is actually what it's really after. Because when you eat the raw food, it has everything intact. There's no disturbance of the cofactor nutrients that work together as an orchestra. And if you look at the data that's coming out recently, it points clearly to the fact it must be uncooked and unprocessed plant-based food. And Prevotella is one of them where we actually see you don't even develop this. This is one of the 3 legs in immune and psychology function of the bacterial count. Doesn't even exist at any significant level without those plant-based foods. Now we're going to take a voyage into different types of problems that we have on other so-called foods that we consume and eat. But look at this. When I was a boy, I was absolutely, utterly convinced that we would starve and I would starve to death if I didn't consume hamburgers and steak. And it was something that everyone aspired to. Now, if you look at the difference, I want you to look at this chart closely at the protein levels in beef versus the protein levels in broccoli. Note that the broccoli has more proteins, by far more proteins. And you also have to understand, when you look at the chart there, that there's a wide array of other nutrients that you do not get by, in fact, consuming a meat diet. And there's a lot of things that you do get that you don't want, like saturated fats. It's so absolutely important for you to understand these things because there's so much evidence on this today. There's no thinking person that could actually debate it. Look at pork versus algae. Once again, we all know that pork's not good, even if you still consume this non-human food. The fact is, algae has significantly more protein, and again, a wide array of other nutrients that you do not get when you consume the pork. But what you do get is more heart attacks, more strokes, more cancer, more diabetes, more premature aging, and more obesity. And we're going to get into this as we go through this presentation. Chicken versus lettuce. This is probably the most interesting of all, because a lot of people out there today, especially people who really think they're in the know, and they go to the health food store and they buy so-called free-range type of animal-based foods. The fact of the matter is that lettuce has significantly more protein than does chicken. Because people say, well, I don't eat meat, I eat chicken. That happens to be a meat. And in fact, when you look at what else is missing when it comes to chicken, here's what they don't tell you. That the brilliant work of my colleague and now deceased friend, Dr. Virginia Livingston, after 70 years of work, told us that the #1 meat cause for every form of cancer happens to be chicken. I never heard anyone getting anything but healthy from lettuce. As a matter of fact, even before there was a move forward in healthy living, everyone knew that lettuce would actually reduce weight and make you feel better. 3 other things I want to point out before we move on. #1, why not cooking? Well, way back in 1933, Rishkikanov over at Pasteur Institute in Paris showed us that when you cook any food, including a plant-based food, that the structure turns to something that appears like a carbon to the immune system. When that happens, the immune system clicks on and attacks it. So that means when you're consuming a cooked food of any type, it's compromising the very immune system that prevents all disease and helps to slow the aging process. The second thing that happened is almost 70 years ago, they discovered heating of any form of oil. We're not just talking about the notorious saturated fat you get in animal-based foods. Literally makes it carcinogenic, and in recent decades, we can also add increases the chances of diabetes and heart disease. That means heart attacks and strokes. Now look at fish versus chia seed. Now fish, of course, people keep going down the list and say, well, I don't eat red meat, I don't eat pork, I eat chicken. And then some say, no, I don't eat chicken, I eat fish. Well, you're going to hear a lot about fish during this time we have together, but the reality is chia seed is significantly higher in all of the things that we want versus fish, which is higher in disease-causing chemistry. So what's the trouble with the water that we have all over the world? Well, you may know, because there's more and more data after I wrote my book more than a decade ago, actually called Killer Fish. There's been documentaries telling you how disastrous humans have been to all the waterways and water systems of the entire planet Earth. Now remember, all of those water systems are one. We think of them as different oceans, lakes, streams, rivers. They're all connected in one way or another. And because of that, every time that humans put chemicals into the environment, they inevitably and eventually end up in a lake, river, stream, brook that ends up in the ocean. Now, because of that, the ocean has done what we call bioaccumulate these toxins and poisons. And all the aquatic life in the ocean, of course, through their gills, are breathing that condensed chemistry every single day with more and more of those chemicals. We all now know about the plastics. There's actually a plastic country, you might as well call it, floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that's larger than the state of California. For more than a quarter of a century, when ships are navigating from Asia to the west coast of the United States, they have to go around this. Now, can you imagine? And all of that degrades in the sun and the salt water, and that gets into the gills and bioaccumulates. And if you look at all the work that's being done on that, it is stunning. Where in fact, the British Journal of Medicine reported about 4 years ago that when you're consuming very little fish, 3 meals a week as an example, you are actually at the end of the year accruing, collecting in the human tissue, the organ systems, 2 ounces of plastic. Now that's estrogenic, and we'll get back to that later. But what are the things that you generally think about? Well, when I was a boy, it wasn't an uncommon thing when you went to the beach to see it was closed for the day. Why? Because 1, 2 people or a group of people the day before, or dozens of people the day, if not hundreds of people the day before, got sick from swimming. And some even died. So there was a study done, a 14-year study, where they looked in the New York State area and found out endless thousands of people, because of bathing in waters, so-called natural waters, were actually hospitalized, and many, many, many people died. And that hasn't become better, by the way. They're just less effective on monitoring that today. California has a larger problem than all of the other states put together, because there is a bioaccumulation problem there that's even worse than in many other parts of the United States and in the world. You start to look at mercury. Of course, when I say fish, even the fish consumers say mercury. Now, believe it or not, this is one of the least problematic things you find in fish. But that's pretty scary. It's a neuro disruptor.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of static from your mic. Can you move the lapel mic to the other side of your jacket? We're getting a lot of static from your mic.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Okay. So what we mean is that the mercury disturbs the brain and the nervous system. It's so problematic when a mother consumes aquatic life when she's pregnant. So what we now know is that in the majority of cases, when these children are looked at and studied, that their brain has permanent damage in it. Their nervous system may never develop the way that it was meant to, because way back, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, even before we had modern science intervene, we recognized the problem with mercury. People would be in close proximity to it. They would become paralyzed, sick, and mentally ill. Matter of fact, the word Mad Hatters, as you recall, came from hat makers, because to stiffen the hats, they used mercury to do that. What a problem that is. And these people inevitably ended up in insane asylums. Now we talk about PAHs and these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And these are unbelievably bad for you. When you start to look at the studies that have been done on this, they directly connect to colon cancer. So whenever we see high amounts of this, it is susceptibility to colon cancer on a complete uprise. And when you start to recognize that certain parts of the world consume larger amounts of aquatic life, we can actually geographically trace now the amount of colon cancer that are in those specific locations in the world. And we're all being told how wonderful fish is, and it's good for you. These are big, well-known problems. PCBs were outlawed in the United States in 1976, not in other parts of the world, but they are going to stay in our environment for thousands, tens of thousands of years. They don't just break down. Now, when they started to look at this, all of the neuron type of diseases and cancers came into focus. Matter of fact, there was no form of neurological disease that wasn't in fact precipitated by having this in the human body, and no form of cancer. So if you want to avoid it, basically from getting multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, brain cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, the list goes on. Basically, do not consume aquatic life. And these are pervasive everywhere on the planet Earth. There's no place, including when they test non-inhabited locations like the North Pole and the South Pole, that we don't find this in the aquatic life. Dioxins, one of the scariest of all. These dioxins were just found to be in all of the water of Long Island, New York. So I was always wondering why the cancer rate, there's a cancer cluster there, is so high. And even the PhD scientists that we work with, when I asked them, what do we do to get those dioxins out? He said, we can do a fair job, but not an excellent job, even with the most sophisticated filtration systems, et cetera. This is why we strongly advise distillation, because you absolutely get to the cleanest hydrogen and oxygen you possibly can, and don't buy into the idea you're going to end up with mineral deficiency. That's pretty much what I've been drinking now for 50 years, and I have the bone density of a young kid. Now, these dioxins are bioaccumulated in farm fish more than anywhere else. And they found the highest amount in salmon. Now, of course, those people that do consume fish and think they're healthy because their holistic doctor, who doesn't know very much and obviously doesn't read science, basically tells them how great it is for the omega oil, are getting significantly more of this disease-causing chemical than anyone else would be doing by eating something they believe is a health food. Wow, pretty scary stuff. Now let's talk about some other things we find. In one of the many books we wrote, this one called Killer Clothes, we actually pointed out that fire retardants being mandated to be put on sleepwear for infants is mental illness at its highest level. That when that was demanded, we actually knew at that point that this altered the brains, nervous system, and cells of the infant's body, the most vulnerable time of their life. It is a mandate in many, many developed countries around the world. Now, what's even more bizarre about this conversation, if a child, unfortunately, was that close to a flame, do you think fire retardants on clothing would prevent the child from being burned? This is sad and ill as far as I'm concerned. And in fact, we do know that it gives children diseases, and it stays in the child's body through the developmental years, right into to adulthood. So they don't just come out at some point. They actually lodge themselves inside of the body. And if you look at the studies that are done on this, when people have been exposed to this fire retardant, which is readily found in fish and aquatic life, bioaccumulated there, you literally have higher incidence of certain diseases as they mature and get older. Sometimes it takes 40, 50 years for the disease to manifest from what happened when you were 1 and 2 and 3 years old. Also, you look at what the University of Miami did. University of Miami looked at the common fish that everyone eats, like salmon again, like cod and big mouth bass. And they saw not only in the waters that are very clean off Florida, because we have the fastest current hitting the shore of Florida in any of the oceans of the world, called the Gulf Stream. And when they tested those fish, they found disease-causing chemicals at such a high amount that they directly linked them to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease, and ALS. But they also went up to the Chesapeake Bay, obviously doesn't have the circulation of the water that we do here in the Gulf Stream, and it was much higher amounts of the same toxic chemicals that you found. So there are scientists that their entire life, marine biologists, for instance, oceanographic scientists, that search these things out on a daily basis every single day. And these are the reports that I'm now sharing with you today. So we're going to go on to dairy food. So people say, okay, well, maybe I don't eat fish and I don't eat chicken and I don't eat pork and I don't eat red meat. But by the way, I've got to have yogurt. I've got to have kefir, which are all milk products. And milk is not a human food. Milk is to take a little calf and create a large 1,000-pound creature. And when we consume milk, our body cells get cross-circuited and they start to react in unique ways. So let's look at milk versus kale. Kale, by the way, has more calcium than milk and more protein than milk. Kale also has a lot of nutrients and doesn't have the saturated fat, or as our colleague, Dr. Campbell, will tell you, giving you the #1 dietary cause of all forms of cancer. The brilliant understanding that he gave all of us more than 30 years ago has been proven out here on the campus of Hippocrates Health Institute for the last 7 decades, because we have taken milk out of the diet. We've taken all animal foods out of the diet. And when we look at what happens with people who come here, in most cases who have consumed those and have created disorders and disease and premature aging, unanimously and universally, we see reversals if a person remains committed to eating a diet and having a mindset that is affirmative. Now, I want you to look at this picture. This is almost perversion, if you think about it. But obviously, we all seem to be a little perverted, because it's easy for us to walk into the store and to buy milk. It's in a carton, and they always have pictures of happy cows on the commercials. And you're thinking, gee, these cows are just really happy that we're pulling their bosoms and taking milk out that's for their baby. They perpetually keep the cow pregnant, which is not a natural state, by the way. And from what I've been told, the poor nipples of the cow are so sore and so inflamed that they constantly are shot with antibiotics. Now, this young, attractive woman under sucking from the nipple, if you saw this when you were driving along on a highway, there would be no doubt in my mind you'd call the police and she would be arrested. But how many times have you consumed milk from the nipple of a cow in the confines of your home, the confines of a restaurant, and nobody arrested you? Nobody thought it was perverted. So let's just get right to these things. Look these things in the eye, think about it. This is relative to reality. I know a lot of you today aren't really sure what's real and what's not. Today we're talking about real. We're talking about factual data that is scientifically based. So acne. In countries, by the way, where there's little to no acne, there is little to no dairy food consumption. Isn't that interesting? What we also know is a higher amount of fat, my old favorite dairies, whipped cream, ice cream, cheeses. By the way, there you have higher amounts of acne. When we remove dairy foods from people's diets, we see a rapid and radical shift in skin outbreaks of acne and other infections, by the way. It's not only acne, but acne is the most notable of all. We look at allergies and asthma. Now, the only time I ever died, and this is not an embellishment, I was 2.5 years old. I died. They put the sheet over me. Happened to be, I had one uncle that was a physician. He was at that hospital that day. A nurse went up and said, go down and console your relatives. Your nephew just died. He came down, pumped my heart, brought me back to life. And throughout my entire youth, I had eczema all over my body, all over my face. When I started to like gals, I was so embarrassed. And little did I know then, as I know now, that lung problems are why people get eczema. So, of course, asthma and eczema are brother and sister. And when I became a vegan, within a matter of 2.5 months, it cleared up. That was over a half a century ago. My lungs today, more than a half a century later, are better and healthier than they were as a child at 20 years old. Now, I saw it firsthand. Allergies. There were some remarkable studies done. A very large one done in Lithuania. I looked at, I think, 3,500 children and looked at the biggest culprits in giving allergies to them. And it was eggs and dairy food. They removed it, and there was an 81% decrease in the symptomology. Singapore did a similar study on 7,000. Exactly the same results happened. Over 80% of people, or the children, by the way, the symptoms went away. How about heart problems? Well, people say, well, you know, I take dairy sometimes, but I don't eat red meat. Fact of the matter is, it's just as bad as red meat. It may even afford you more saturated fat than red meat, because I know as much as I consumed meat at one point in my life, I consumed a lot more dairy. You didn't have that many varieties of meat, but you had so many ways that you could get dairy in, and so many ingredients required, or so many recipes, I should say, required dairy food. And so we got so much of that into our bodies, and it is directly linked with heart attacks and strokes. So the Mayo Clinic actually showed us that, and they showed us that there's a certain chemical that comes into the body and actually creates that. It's a protein blocking chemical, and it reduces something called nitric oxide in the body. And when you start to mess with nitric oxide and you actually have a coagulated protein that block the arteries, you're actually on your way, as I say, a fast train towards having death and dying occur. How about bone problems? This is the most ironic of the entire discussion when it comes to dairy food. I was literally convinced as a child, as all of you were, no matter where you are on the planet Earth, that if we didn't consume dairy, our bones would fracture. Study after study show that's inversely the opposite of true. Harvard went out and looked at it and saw no connection to high calcium or high dairy consumption to less fractures. The same amount of fractures people had, by the way, when they didn't consume dairy food at high amounts. And in fact, the studies went further to say, the more you consumed, the higher possibility that you would have a fracture. Now that's ironic, isn't it? We have day after day, new data information coming into us on this very subject. Now just think of what I've said so far. This is going to create everything from skin disorders to asthma, to allergies, to bone fractures. And we haven't stopped yet. How about breast cancer? So many years ago, we started to recognize here at the Institute, as well as all over the research community globally on breast cancer and other forms of cancer, there's something called IGF-1. It's an inflammatory marker that is the highest in dairy food, milk, and all of the things we make from milk. And if you really want to have breast cancer, that's one of the best ways to have it. If you saw studies that were done on this, they actually find the DNA of the very dairy that the person consistently consumes. Now, there's other factors too, emotional factors, bacteria in the mouth, but when you compound all of these and you add one on top of the other on top of the other, the likelihood that a woman is going to end up with breast cancer, or even a man, by the way, because men do get breast cancer, is dramatically increased. So when you look at these studies, and all of these are available, and I only reflect what is representative of dozens, if not hundreds of other studies when I'm making these presentations for you. How about colon cancer? Again, TMOA, something that we actually found a number of years ago, actually is directly linked to this. And when you look at what happens, it gets into the body, mutates the cell, and actually affects the colon more than anything else. And there were studies even published by the United Nations, since governments around the world who were in bed with the dairy industry and all of the other meat-related industries, by the way, were unwilling to tell the public what was coming out from the scientific community. And colon cancer was right there at the top of the list from consuming. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you have the IGF-1 problem on that one. You also have the MMTO problem on that one. It's a different form of chemistry in the body that literally mutates the cell, specifically in the lymphatic system in this case, leading to this type of lymphoma. The lymphoma is a lymphatic system cancer. And by the way, all cancers have a lymphatic connection, but this one specifically, the epicenter is right there. How about depression? This is one that nobody ever puts on their radar, but there is data on this one that is, you could write books on it. Let me put it that way. There were studies done in Australia, the United States, Europe, that actually show you the higher amount of fatty dairy you consume, the higher amount of depression people have. Now, we're not saying this is all because of the brain. Remember, dairy must do something awfully bad in the gastrointestinal tract to wipe out the effectiveness of the healthy bacteria. And it actually brings in unwanted bacteria and starts to precipitate neuron dysfunction, that the serotonin receptor sites are shut off. And remember, the serotonin is what allow you not to be depressed. If you have adequate amount of serotonin pump coming out from the gastrointestinal flora, 90% of it comes out from there. And this is really amazing when you start to look at it. They went further to say that the highest amount, people actually are prone to even more schizophrenia. Now, these are not studies done flippantly, where they just looked at one group. They're looking at hundreds of people over long periods of time. They're taking people who have problems and taking control groups and comparing them, and the people who are consuming dairy and the people who are not consuming dairy. And it's pretty easy to do. In most populations, you have people eating Asian diets that consume little to no dairy food. And in the Anglo diet, it's widely consumed. So it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to have control groups that do not consume dairy, and look at the mental health of people and the depression levels of people who are consuming dairy versus who are not consuming dairy. This is an obvious one, gastrointestinal problems. By the way, where do you think most colic comes from with children? You're feeding them another animal's milk and formula, which is unbelievable. It's mostly sugar. And so the gastrointestinal tract starts to ferment. You go way back in studies on this one 100 years ago, and they told us then what would happen. And it's even more knowledge we have today. So directly from dairy food, we have all kinds of gastro problems. And these problems accumulate not only to something acute like colon cancer, which we just mentioned, but you may have more diverticulosis, diverticulitis, Crohn's disease, colitis, the list goes on, irritable bowel syndrome. We see it right here. When we remove the dairy food and start to give them healthy, living, plant-based roughage, we start to see almost instantaneous changes in the symptomology. And then the data that we're getting in examination and testing starts to prove out within a matter of days and weeks. Obesity is an obvious one, but there's some little hidden secrets here that you may not know. So at one point, if you would ask me, if a person's not going to listen to what you have to say, and they're going to consume dairy anyway, and let's just relate it to fat, being overweight, being obese, which would be the one that would be least likely to make them fat? I would have incorrectly said to you, low-fat milk and skim milk. Well, boy, that was blown out of the water by DeBow at the University of Virginia. They actually looked at this and saw in long-term studies that when you actually took the low-fat and the skim milk, you had a 57% increase in being overweight. Isn't that stunning? Why? Because obviously the saturated fats do cause a problem, but they're not the only culprit in this picture. There's other fat-producing chemistry within the non-human food we call cow's milk. And don't think I'm only saying cow's milk. It's not healthy to take sheep or goat's milk either. Now let's get to eggs, because people say, well, you know, I don't eat meat and I don't eat dairy food. I'm a vegan, but I've really bought into the story about it being a real food, and I just don't want to let go of that last refuge of consuming an animal in some way, or the milk out of the bosom of an animal. I just can't let go of it. So I'm going to consume eggs. And I hear a lot of this on the campus. All I do is eat eggs. Well, let's hope not. What we know is eggs versus flaxseed. Flaxseed wins right down the list, hands down. The only creature on the planet Earth that can digest an egg, which is, by the way, an unborn chicken in an egg. It's like a fetus, an unborn chicken in a shell. Basically, it's a fox. A fox has the enzymatic ability to break down the entire egg, and they're little sneaky guys. They know how to get into the nest and get the eggs, etc. And you're not capable of doing that. Matter of fact, when you start to hear how bad eggs are, let's hope you don't even consider them ever again, or when you're out there talking to other people that you love, tell them not to consume them. So cholesterol is obviously the biggie. The highest of all animal-based foods in cholesterol are eggs, up to 230 grams in one egg. Now, I never stopped at one egg. I would eat a half a dozen eggs when I was cooking them, and I'd fry them in butter, right? And then you put pepper on them or something else that was bad for you. So you had a triune of disease-causing whatever it was you were consuming at that stage. And so eggs' cholesterols are a problem for you. But a lot of people say, well, you know, I don't care about that because I consume, different parts of the eggs. We're going to get back to that in a minute. They have no fiber. So when you eat something like an egg, the receptor sites within the intestinal tract, within the stomach, that tell you that you're filled are shut off. And so you can consume more and more and more and have an unnatural hunger to eat more of the eggs or more of whatever you're eating, because we're not getting messages from the plants that your body's built to get messages from. But how about diabetes? Well, this is a shocker. When you eat 3 to 5 eggs a week, not a day, you have actually a 2-time greater chance of getting type 2 diabetes. Let me repeat this. 100% increased chance in getting type 2 diabetes if you eat 3 to 5 eggs. We don't stop there. If you eat over 5 eggs, now you're really cruising for a bruising. You get triple the chance, 3 times the chance of getting type 2 diabetes. So if you want diabetes, if you want gastrointestinal problems, if you want more cholesterol, go ahead and eat it. How about liver damage? Well, what we know is that fatty liver is on an upswing, and people who aren't even drinking alcohol, that used to be the main culprit, are getting fatty liver disease. And right there at the head of the arrow is an egg, because that undigested protein and cholesterol that's in there actually has to be processed through the gallbladder. When the gallbladder is overwhelmed and can't do it, it spills over to the liver. And this is probably the #1 cause, along with dairy, of creating fatty liver disease. That I'm very familiar with, because I lost my very young 50-year-old brother to that disease. He ate himself to the grave by eating these non-foods. Don't follow his suit. Endotoxins. So these are found in the eggs, but when we start to look at why eggs have more, remember, the mother has to give an awful lot of nutrients to that little baby chicken inside of the egg so they can grow and develop over the time period that it's meant to develop, to come out and to be alive. And we see so many enterotoxins in this that are related directly to neurological disorders. So as we talked about with fish, as we talked about with dairy, we see a very similar thing in here with bioaccumulation. How about salmonella? In our book, Poison Poultry, I reported a study that was done internationally in nearly 70 countries around the world, where they looked at eggs, and they looked at half of them were called ecological, biological, organic. That's all organic eggs. And what they found is that 90% of eggs had either salmonella or E. coli. Now think of that. 9 out of 10 eggs from over 70 countries spread out all throughout the planet Earth, literally 90% of them had salmonella or E. coli, or both salmonella and E. coli. Now, you don't even have to cook them and eat them. You just have to touch them and rub your eye or put your finger in your mouth, because that's how you can get these things. Probably the number one vehicle for salmonella are eggs consumption, then chicken, obviously, we all knew about that, but why wouldn't the baby egg have it in it as well at a bioaccumulated level, a higher level than the mother did? So you say, well, egg whites, as I said, we'll be back to that. Egg whites are not digestible. They don't have the high cholesterol levels. They have high coagulated protein levels that actually stick the veins and ventricles together, the capillaries together, and actually increase blood pressure, chances of heart attacks and strokes, phlebitis within the legs, a great way to get sick. So all of these non-foods are not necessary. That's really the point we're making here. How about heart risk? Again, every single time we're telling you how heart implications are there. Once again, eggs are right there at the top of the list and problematic for anyone who doesn't want to die of a heart attack and stroke. Still the number one killer in most of the developed countries of the world. And then fatal illness. This is really the scariest part, because when they looked at overall animal food consumption, everything I've mentioned now, but let me labor over this because I think it's worth doing. Red meat, chicken, turkey, quail, pork, red meat, fish, and crustaceans, which are aquatic life, eggs, milk, cheese, butter, yogurt, kefir, the list goes on, whipped cream. When people consume these throughout their life, they have a 4-time greater chance of dying of cancer. Now think of what I've just said to you. If everything else went in one ear and out the other, let's hope this doesn't go in one ear and out the other. Fatal illness is increased by 4-fold, 4 times if you consume animal-based foods. And this was a long-term study done with a large population of people where it's really not challengeable. You can challenge it, but why when the data and the evidence is so absolutely abundantly clear? So it's been my experience over the many, many, many decades that I've had the privilege to direct Hippocrates Health Institute, that when people come here suffering from these disorders, every disorder you can possibly imagine, and we remove the toxic, noxious non-foods that they've been told by their culture, their society, their doctors, their dietitians, even their so-called nutritionists are healthy for them, they begin to become healthy. We've won international awards where more people have come to Hippocrates and reversed major disorders than any institute in the history of healthcare. We're not fortunate, like doctors and hospitals on the front line. When people are ill, they're the first touch point. Usually after people have been through that process and they're not getting to where they wanted to get, and they're not getting healthier, they come here. And we're now helping these people purely with plant-based lifestyle. We took it to a totally different level. It's not just plant-based lifestyle that's processed, cooked to make your life convenient, but it's the original diet of the human species, a raw, organic, plant-based diet. And when we have employed this here on this very campus with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, and our medical team, our medical doctors, our nurses who are doing testing, everything from blood testing to scanning, we've observed what's happened. There's radical improvements universally with these people. So this is not a unique place on the planet Earth. What we're achieving here can be achieved in your own home. What we're offering you here is not a secret. Not only do we write books and spend many, many hours a year, like I am today, speaking to you anywhere in the world that you want to access this information, but we do conferences worldwide. And we want you to know how to do this because we have one objective, not only to help you heal and prevent disease and aging, but help humanity put on the brake and immediately reverse the catastrophic trends we call modern lifestyle, living, and diet. And if we all wake up and let go of our habitual patterns and addictions, we can stop that trend. And I'm sure we can, because I see it every day of my life. So thanks for listening. Now we'll get to any questions you may have.
All right, thanks, Brian, for that. So let me explain to everyone what we're going to do here. For the Q&A session, we normally don't take questions directly from the chat. Instead, we ask everyone to virtually raise their hand. If you're not sure how to do this, what you do is click on your reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom window, then click on the raised hand function in the menu that pops up. We will then take questions in the order in which you receive them. When it's your turn, we'll unmute you and prompt you to ask your questions. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, first we have David. David, what is your question?
Hi, how you doing?
Hi, David.
My main question is, given what's going on in Ukraine and the fact that there could be a nuclear accident, there's been a run on potassium iodide tablets in Europe and throughout the world. I was curious to know what you would recommend if such an accident did occur. And secondly, I don't know if you could briefly describe what you do when you go on an airplane before and after and during, using the colloidal silver and your negative ion device, or anything else you could share that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so Ukraine is the latest concern we have about potential nuclear holocaust. I spend a lot of time generally in Europe and recognize that some of the countries there have actually told populations since Chernobyl they should not inhabit that part of the country they're living in for at least 100,000 years. So this is a real thing. And there's seemingly a perpetual need for people to sabotage human existence. And it's humans doing that. It's not other creatures doing it. So with that said, no question the potassium iodine would be helpful, but something that we've known for years, and I used when I went to Russia after Chernobyl and worked with the government there, and physicians and research scientists out of both universities in Moscow and St. Petersburg, is we were putting people in very hot bathtubs right up to their nose so they could only breathe for at least 20 to 30 minutes. And it was saturated with kelp. And we were also having them consume high amounts, 100 to 200, depending upon their weight, little tablets of chlorella. So we know the algae are actually antidotes to radiation poisoning. Now, continuing on with radiation, many of the listeners may not know, a plane ride from New York City to Los Angeles, you're receiving the equivalent of 28 X-rays. That's what accrues in your body from cosmic radiation that comes from the atmosphere, obviously the little tiny metal is not going to prevent that. It may even amplify it, frankly. So ever since I was aware enough to do this 40 years ago, I've been taking silver and the nostril spray type, and every hour, starting when I'm getting on the plane, thereafter, I spray 2 spurts up each nostril, blow out and suck in, and place 2 spurts down my throat. Now, they recycle the air for the last 15 or 20 years. And so if somebody's sick in the front of the plane and you're in the last seat, it's being recycled. So that actually drops the percentage of people getting sick. We know the average 2.5-hour plane ride, approximately 15% of people get sick on every one of those planes. And if you've ever seen microscopic exposés on what a plane looks like and the seats look like, it's difficult for me to get on planes. I have to, and I do it anyway. The next thing, forever I've been using a personal oxygen device. And the newest ones from Asia are tremendous because they work with electron activity and actually kill off every microbe. So you put them around your neck. I should have worn one today to show you. And 3 feet in every direction around me, in front of me and around me, it permeates that. So if somebody coughs or somebody is sick in some way, it cannot get through that virtual shield. It's not really even virtual, it's real, but it's an invisible shield that you see. So that should be around your neck. My wife wears one here all of the time. And by the way, it's something that would be wise for you to put in the bag that you always take before you get onto a plane. This is what I do so I don't forget to do it, which I used to do all of the time. One bag, no matter what plane I go on, that is in that bag. There's other things that you may want. Everyone wants to watch movies on the plane. And so you have to get earbuds that are not going to zap your brain and give you brain cancer. And there's GIA, G-I-A, that makes a great set. I've been using those for about 30 years now. And these are things that people, common sense things, inexpensive things, that just a little bit of effort is going to make your life much healthier and longer, by the way. Good questions.
Do you think nattokinase should also be used to prevent blood clots on planes?
If somebody has they're prone to blood clots, yes. Natto, which is actually a traditional Japanese food, highly, highly, highly fermented, almost like a paste, soy, which doesn't have the estrogenic effect. So I'm not worried about that with cancer. Literally is, when they compare it to the meds, Plavix, et cetera, they get about the same results. So much safer to do. But you know, if you're a person who's going to go on a very long plane ride, for instance, 24 hours, even a healthy person, it may not be a bad thing to consider.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for that, David, and thank you, Brian. Next, we have Wendy. Wendy, what is your question?
Yes, please. I have 2 questions. One about fermented foods. Are they healthy if I take a raw cabbage and ferment it with Himalayan sea salt? And the second question is I get my spirulina from Chile, from the spring water reserve. Is spirulina healthy for a vegan person?
Well, let's start with spirulina, and then we'll go back to your first question. So spirulina, like chlorella, has an inherent shell on it. And so most spirulinas on the market are very difficult to digest. So the one, when we investigated this 40 some years ago, we recognized that there's a unique lake here in the United States, Clement Lake, that is volcanic. So the center of this massively large lake is only 8 feet deep. Most areas it's 2-3 feet. Now that part of Oregon is uniquely sunny. It only rains 5 days a year. So this is like an environment that nature created that's nowhere else that we've discovered so far. Very large, shallow lake, very sunny area. So it's a perfect growing ground for algae. And blue-green algae is spirulina. It's another way we talk about it, a cyanobacteria. Now, when you talk about them, all of them have shells because in most environments, they require shells to preserve them. In this unique lake, they have a glucanase, carbohydrate-based cell wall, so even an infant can digest it. So that would be what I would suggest, this is the one I've been taking now for 4 decades, given my children, and have suggested to hundreds of thousands of people over the time. And your first question, once again, was?
Fermented foods.
Fermented food, I'm a major fan of. If you look at what I spoke about recently on The Real Truth About Health, the importance of bacteria, I talked about the types of bacteria, how to get the bacteria. You may want to review that when it comes up. I talked about people who live long lives. Almost every one of these tribes consistently consume fermented food. Now, it is so easy to make sauerkraut, the same juicer that you would make a slow turning juicer, wheatgrass in or green juice, not fast centrifugal juicer that kills everything and oxidizes it, but like the teeth, slow turning without oxidize. And you put cabbage through that, it homogenizes the cabbage. And if you like it a little more rough, then you can cut some pieces up, put it in, sit it out with a screen on top of it for 3 days in your kitchen. And by the way, you have sauerkraut within a matter of 3 days. It doesn't take months like we were taught traditionally by Germans and other people. Kimchi, you can do the same thing with. You can also take organic cabbage juice and actually take any vegetable, cut them small enough, soak them for a week in that, and you have fermented. Now, you talked about sodium. I wouldn't put sodium. We don't put sodium in ours here at Hippocrates that we have out consistently, but you may feel you need that. Traditional ones put juniper berries in it, wakame, a seaweed, so you get massive amounts of minerals, and it actually makes the wakame digestible that way. So there's lots of fun things you can do with the sauerkraut or with the kimchi. Big fan of fermented foods because it helps both your brain, your psyche, and your immunity. Who you really are, your brain and immunity.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Wendy, for that. Next, we have Stephanie. Stephanie, what is your question?
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for taking our questions. Huge fan of your work. So I have 2 questions. First question is, I'm a 39-year-old, relatively healthy female, but I just found out that I had high blood pressure and tachycardia. So throughout this conference, one of the most controversial things is the fats, the nuts, the seeds, the oils, the avocados, and I've been kind of confused about that. What would your advice be for me, like portion-wise, how much to eat, how often to eat them? Should I be eating them? Should I, that's the first question. And then the second one is, how do you feel about food-grade hydrogen peroxide, either swished around in the mouth for oral health or taken for general health orally? Thank you so much.
Well, your grandmother had 2 medicines in her medicine cabinet, iodine and hydrogen peroxide. But we've come a long way in science since those days. They're both disinfectants, and we make stabilized oxygens that you can buy at the health store that are safe. So when you're ingesting them, they're not going to harm you. If you, by mistake, swallow too much intense hydrogen peroxide, it would have a negative outcome. And by the way, you don't absorb as much as you would with a stabilized oxygen. Big fan of them, use them all of the time. Secondly, when you talk about high blood pressure, first and foremost, is always accompanied by stress. So a lot of people may eat healthy diets, but they don't exercise much to let the gas valve go off, to relax. And by the way, they're in a stressful relationship. They're not happy with their job or all of the above. And that it precipitates that. Just like if I screamed at the top of my lungs now, all of you would get stressed and you'd stop breathing and the blood pressure would go up instantaneously. The second thing you have to look at to rule out, because well over 90% of the people do not have this problem, but it's a possibility, is our medical team. I would look at, for instance, the kidney, the creatine, the bun, because if, by the way, you're one of the rare cases that have a kidney concern, no matter what you eat, you could have a blood pressure problem. You can work with it, but you have to know that's a causative reason. Now, the big thing is, let's get back to that question about oil and not oil and all of this other stuff. Being the director of the oldest plant-based institute in the world that created lifestyle medicine, we made the word lifestyle medicine. back almost 70 years ago. Basically, we had been watching what people do, eating moderate amounts of oil, exercising. Everyone gets psychotherapy here to learn how to tame their brain and calm their stress. A little bit of oil is not going to be the reason that you'd end up with high blood pressure. If you're eating animal oil, just my presentation today, it's every bit of that's linked to high blood pressure. No question. And what's ironic to me is some of the plant-based doctors that are going to tell you how it's evil and oil is bad, et cetera, almost act like it's animal fat that you're eating. It's not the same thing. Now, there's saturate, monosaturate, polyunsaturated. Some are easier to go through the body than others. But my understanding clearly, not only from the work I've done since 1970, but the work that's being done on the front line of science globally, is that oils are necessary for healthy bodies. Now, doesn't mean you take a lot of oil. At one point, I would eat my salad with my oil. That's not what I'm talking about. A very small amount of oil being used and eating foods that are germinated. So if you take any food, any plant-based food, they have oil in it. Mostly omega oils, oleic acids, good oils, ones your body and brain require. And if you germinate it, those fats are already broken down to essential fatty acids, making it remarkably more usable by the body for energy. If you're just taking oil out of a bottle, which I'll tell you occasionally I still do and spray on my salad. I did before I came today to talk to you. It's not the same. It's really something that you may want to avoid, but you certainly do need to get oils for your brain and body and energy function to have. So really look at the first two things that I talked about. Most likely that's the causative reason for you. And then if it's a kidney, get in touch with us here at Hippocrates. I'll give you some further advice on that. And by the way, just go light on the oils. That's always been our belief here. Not to wipe them out completely, but to go light on them.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. Thank you, Brian. Next, we have Aaron. Aaron, what's your question?
Hi, Dr. Brian. I have two quick questions. One is a follow-up to the fermented cabbage that you said. So if I understood you correctly, you recommend to use a juicer to create a cabbage juice, and then after 3 days, you put it on the shelf, then you can put into it the cabbage pieces, and then you create a fermented cabbage. Is this the way you recommend?
No, let's explain it to you. So the same juicer, slow turning auger juicer or press that you would make wheatgrass or green juice with, something that has high quality, deep cell juice, get out of it. That same juicer, you put organic cabbage through. And I'll preface this by saying the purple or the darker cabbage have more minerals in it. Whenever you see something with darker color like that, it has more minerals. Now, that's mush. It comes out mushy. Now, I don't mind that, but some people say, I want it a little bit more roughage. So you mix into that finely cut cabbage or long strands of cabbage. Now you mix it all together, put it in a large jar. If you don't have a crock pot, that's the ideal, but not everyone's going to buy a crock pot. A big, nice gallon jar, and you put a screen on the top so no bugs come in and out. And on the very top of that bottle, where you have the cabbage sitting, you basically put one leaf. So that bacteria is not going to interact. It's going to hit that leaf rather than the mushed up cabbage. 3 days later, remember you have a screen on it, you're going to have sauerkraut. Now, you can I like garlic in there, juniper berries, et cetera, et cetera. And let's talk about a second subject. You can take the same cabbage, not put an auger in, put the juice mechanism into the juicer. Now you actually make the juice of cabbage. Now you have a glass or a bottle of juiced cabbage. And you literally can take other vegetables, generally root vegetables work good with this. Jicama and turnips and rutabaga, things like this. You now cut them small, stick them in, let them sit for 6-7 days. They ferment. It's another way to get it. You can actually take small pickling cucumbers. You can make your own, put garlic in it, make your own dill pickles. And these are living, these are raw. and they're loaded with good bacteria. Now, grant you, they don't have all the healthy bacteria you need. They just have some of the bacteria that actually support, with the roughage of the sauerkraut, the roughage of the fermented vegetable, the gastrointestinal health. And that's what we're after.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, the next question is from Benny. Benny, I'm going to unmute you. Please ask your question.
Brian, thank you so much for sponsoring this great conference. One of the controversial topics still seems to be whether raw vegan diet is the best. Would you address to some people who may be confused by those doctors and others who've appeared that tout either cooked, whole food, plant-based, and even some who've recommended animal foods and animal products?
Well, let me just be utterly clear. I don't think there is any serious doctor or scientist that would debate that raw food is healthier for you than cooked food. If there is, next year, let me debate them. Please, let's get a panel of people that say you have to live on cooked food. And even better yet, put people on that panel or another panel. I prefer another panel on that. Let's say you require animal-based foods. And let's have that debate. But for you, the thinking listener, obviously, if there are those people, they're not thinking. When you cook a food, these are factual statements, not opinions. You're disturbing the proteins. They're not complete. You're pretty much wiping out the vitamins. You literally are taking the minerals and diluting them, and you can get to the point where you cook as much as my mother used to cook. There's very little minerals in it. You're also killing the four things that we've discovered here that are why this program keeps us young and why this program has been so effective in helping people reverse major disorder and stopping the aging process. Not stopping, excuse me, slowing the aging. I wish I could stop it. It's slowing the aging process. It's hormones. Once you cook it at about 115 degrees, the hormones are gone. The hormones are the language, chemical language that come from the food. And you say, well, there are no hormones in food. Where do you think they get bioidentical hormones from? Of course, there's hormones in plants. The oxygen. We knew in 1917 that you required oxygen present with nutrients, vitamins, minerals, et cetera, before they are absorbed and digested into the human cell. Gone when you cook it to 115. Phytochemicals, the most important. I write books on this. And so the phytochemicals are the magic elements that nature weaved into plants to reverse disease. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of years before humans showed up. And lastly, but not less, is enzymes. Enzymes are the catalyst of life. When your sperm and egg came together and you were created, it was an enzyme activity that literally did that. So we call it the new era of hope. Hormones, oxygen, phytochemicals, and enzymes are killed. So if you look at the brilliant work of not doctors who are selling diets, but the real researchers, like Dr. David Williams at Linus Pauling Institute, who's the world's leading authority on phytonutrients and how they reverse and prevent disease. He will tell you straight on. He's on my faculty, on my online program, that once you cook a food, these are gone. And so I don't know why we have to struggle. I know a lot of these doctors, congratulations, you finally gave up meat, you finally gave up dairy, some of you gave up eggs, some of you gave up fish. Congratulations, we want to honor you. But just because you did that and that's where you stopped, let's not stop the conversation there. Let's not take away from the people that believe in you the real science that goes well beyond just what we don't eat. I'm not only interested in what we don't eat, I'm interested in what we eat. That is equally, if not more important, isn't it? The other fact is that there has never been a study on longevity and caloric intake, the amount of food we eat, that doesn't tell you people who eat the highest amount of nutritious food in the smallest amount live the longest and have the least disease. So that's what the living food, raw, organic, plant-based diet affords you. A lot of these talking heads tell you you need more calories, you need more fruit, you need more carbohydrates, you need more beans. The fact is, there has never been a study on longevity and disease that doesn't tell us high nutrients in small amounts are who lives the longest, has the least disease. So if we want to have debates with these talking heads, I welcome it next year on The Real Truth About Health. Be prepared.
Okay, next we have Juliet. Juliet, what is your question?
Hi, I was wondering, is it safe to eat seaweed? I was told that it contains heavy metals.
If anyone ate seafood after my presentation today, you're suicidal. That's all I can say. So there should be no seafood consumed. The only thing out of the sea that can be consumed are sea plants, sea vegetables. Now, you heard a question early on. He said, what do you do to prevent radiation? My answer was, when I was brought to Russia by the Russian government, we were using seaweeds to remove radiation. So even if, and it is, radiation and heavy metals riddle the oceans of the world, the plant, which is the oldest type of plants on the earth, these sea vegetables, inherently have a resistant factor where they don't absorb at any significant level these type of chemicals. So you should not ever consider eating anything out of the ocean that's alive other than a plant out of there, seaweed.
Okay, thanks for that, Brian. Okay, unfortunately, we've run out of time. But Brian, we thank you every time you come here at The Real Truth About Health. And I just don't want to thank you. I think everyone else here wants to thank you as well. So what does everyone have to say for Brian Clement?
That was amazing. We love you.